Good afternoon. Let me first just make a couple of comments that are non-Cuba related, then I'll talk about my Cuba trip some. First, we had the monthly revenue report that came out that was released by Department of Finance Administration. I was pleased that we are 3.9% above forecast over projection. And so this is a good start for the year. I've continued to be encouraged by the sales tax revenue uptick. And overall, I think it shows that it's good momentum for our economy in Arkansas, but we're keeping an eye on it month by month. Secondly, I just want to give you an update on the computer coding initiative that I continue to be excited about. The last report, I think I indicated we had 1,400 that had enrolled in the online courses. The new number is that there's 1,600 students across Arkansas that have enrolled in the computer coding class for this semester. This does not count the ones that have enrolled in face-to-face classes in the classroom, and we won't have those numbers, I think, till required to be in October 15th, maybe released publicly November 1. But just an anecdote, I was down at the Manufacturing Expo at Plasti Tech today, and there I came across a North Little Rock computer science teacher who had actually not had any background in computer science, had been trained for, was teaching this year in North Little Rock, face-to-face class with 24 students. That excites me about this being in the classroom, the initiative of the teachers to learn it and to present it, and then the response of the students. So very pleased with that momentum on computer coding in the classroom. And then let me comment on my Cuba trip. And I really covered a lot whenever I had the telephone conference with you. Since that telephone conference, I continued to engage in minister-level meetings, and it was remarkable because as I went and met with the Minister of Trade, and then also they have the Council of Ministers, which is the overarching governing body for the centralized government. And I met with the deputy minister there, and he remarked that this is the first time that the American flag had been in the Cuba building at the ministry that we had the meeting. And it was also the first time that the ambassador, De Laurentiis, had been in that building. And this just reflects the historic time of re-engagement after literally 55 years of broken diplomatic relations. And also just to give a picture of Cuba at this historic juncture. As I was in Cuba, we saw Brazil investments in infrastructure at the Port of Mariel. I saw European visitors coming to Cuba. The president of Vietnam was in Havana meeting at high levels, as I was, marketing Vietnamese products, including rice. As I was in Cuba, we also had the Department of Homeland Security, TSA, in Cuba negotiating continued or starting regular commercial flights from the United States to Cuba. And of course, that requires a number of different protocols to be initiated in terms of security, airlines. But the point of those different connections to what was happening in Cuba while we were there indicates to me the significant momentum for trade, the significant momentum for travel, under the new rules that President Obama has initiated. And so it's a historic time. I think there is significant momentum. I've cautioned that we have to proceed carefully. and with a great deal of patience. I think what you will see in the coming months would be a resumption after many years of regularized commercial flights. The fact that the President has increased the level of remittances that U.S. citizens can make back to Cuba will change somewhat the dynamics there on the ground that will allow more cash spending by the average Cuban residents. And then, as a result of all of this, increased travel, increased exchange, and increased foreign investment, I'm convinced that you're going to see a growing public dynamic in the United States for changing the rules and continuing down the path of re-engagement with Cuba. People comment from time to time that Cuba is a country stalled in time. And of course, that is reflected by the 1950s automobiles all across the country. It is reflected in the incredibly beautiful buildings that were constructed largely prior to the 1955-1960 time frame and have not been kept up to date since then, or new infrastructure built. But it's also, in a sense, lost in time because there's continued discussion by the leadership of the Cuban government about the revolution, about their angst with the United States, about their commitment to the principles of the revolution and the centralized government. And you contrast that with China and Vietnam. China that I visited, I've met with high government officials, and they will talk in terms of their capitalistic structure. Despite the fact that they're still a communist nation, they will engage in discussion about the market system and how they're growing their economy and about capitalism and markets. But in Cuba, it's still stuck in time in terms of we still want to maintain a centralized government. We still want to maintain that control. You're going to have to deal with the government, and we're not going to turn everything over to the market. And so it's a different dynamic, and that is at the higher levels of the Cuban government. If you get on the street, you talk to the entrepreneurs, people that want to be entrepreneurs, it's a totally different dialogue and a desire for more small businesses, more control by family-owned businesses, and a receptivity to the U.S. market and a desire for that trade. And so they've got a ways to go. I think you're going to see continued pressure. I think the first great opportunity, of course, is the extension of credit on our agricultural sales, and then secondly, the loosening of the travel restrictions on U.S. citizens going to Cuba. And so I think those will be two of the first steps that we'll see, maybe not in the coming months, but in the coming years. So with that, I'll turn it over for questions.
Governor, not related to Cuba, Oklahoma's executions are basically on hold again with court ruling today. I want to see if what's happened there with that order today, if that's giving you any pause about Arkansas resuming executions, and also with what happened with them being sent the wrong drug. Do you have any second thoughts about signing that law that gave secrecy to the drug suppliers?
No, I think that law was a good law. It was an important law that allowed the marketplace to work better and the supply without the private sector worrying about retaliation or reaction from their suppliers. So I think that confidentiality is important. In terms of where we are, the courts have said all the court processes are complete and that the execution date can be set, and it has been set. Had it not been set, then we would be sitting here 2 years, 3 years from now, waiting for the next court challenge. And so nothing moves if the governor does not set the date. and that has required any additional challenges to be made. Ultimately, the courts will review and make a decision. If they intervene, we will obviously be obedient to the rules of the court, but thus far there has not been any, the courts have said proceed.
I guess, has it given you any pause to, or any thoughts about maybe pausing or delaying the execution of the schedule?
No. I think we are my job as governor is to faithfully execute the laws. Our legislative body has approved the death penalty as an appropriate sanction in extremely heinous cases. Once the courts have reviewed it, said guilt is established, due process is required, the courts have reviewed it. It's my job as chief executive of this state to carry out the law. I have no regret about that. That's my responsibility.
Governor, regarding, getting back to Cuba, regarding the, you said the loosening of credit and also the travel restrictions, have you talked with any of our business executives, especially in the rice and poultry industry, concerning possible their engagement in Cuba, and how long do you foresee, some movement happening in those markets?
What's the last part?
How long do you foresee some movement happening in those markets that are particularly strong in Arkansas?
Well, first of all, the agricultural community was part of the delegation on this trip, and a very important part of it. We had the president of the Arkansas Farm Bureau. We had Bill Reed with Riceland Foods. We had Mark Simmons with Simmons Industries, and we had Tyson's Foods represented as well, along with our Secretary of Agriculture. I was engaged in a lot of government-to-government meetings. They were simultaneously really speaking with some of the business people there, the agency that makes the purchases, and to see what the market potentials are. In each occasion that we had meetings, our agricultural leaders extended an invitation to the Cuban Ministry of Agriculture, the Cuban Ministry of Trade, to come and visit Arkansas. And that is important, that they not only hear from us, but they actually see what we have in terms of our production and the quality of our rice and all that we offer in this state. And I would encourage you, by the way, to talk to different members of the delegation. I think they will share the openness, the information that they received, and the opportunities that might be there for the future. In terms of substance, we can make sales to Cuba right now. We can sell our agricultural products, but it has to be on a cash basis. And interestingly, as I talked to the Cuban officials, they, after I supported this in Congress, the reinstitution of agricultural sales, they made many purchases from the United States, including Arkansas, of rice and poultry. They stopped that because they said, why should we neglect our historic trading partners for the new potential partner, the United States, when they're not extending the same credit terms? And so it was really about a couple years ago that those sales dried up. Even though they can make cash purchases, they're using their purchasing capacity with other countries right now. And so we're not competing with Brazil, we're not competing with Vietnam that can offer credit terms. That's the next step, is that Congress needs to equalize the field of operations for our businesses by allowing them to negotiate cash, credit, whatever they feel comfortable with and the level of risk they wish to take. So I hope that is the next step. In terms of timing, I think there'll be continued negotiation, pushing for sales opportunities, but they'll really be opened up if we can pass the credit extensions.
Governor, does or would the Ex-Im Bank figure into specifically Arkansas trade, either ag or manufactured products, finished goods to Cuba?
It's my understanding that The easing of the credit, allowing credit to be extended, does two things. One, most importantly, it allows our agricultural companies here in Arkansas to sell on credit. It might be 60 days, it might be 90 days, it might be whatever is negotiated. Right now, we can't even negotiate a credit sale, and that's not customary in the market. And then, secondly, the question as to whether it would be government support for those sales or government support for the extension of credit through the EXIM Bank or other means. I'd have to look actually more specifically at the legislation that Senator Bozeman has that may be impacted. Most importantly is to allow the negotiation between our marketers here and the Cuban government on those sales.
Your understanding, though, the EXIM Bank could be a vehicle for...
It historically is. It is, yes, it is historically in every other country an opportunity to assist U.S. manufacturers or others in foreign sales. I think, that could be exempted from Cuba, and they might just make it a business to government extension of credit, so that'll just depend upon what Congress will do.
Do I take it then, sir, you would prefer to see the EXIM Bank renewed? Reauthorized?
Oh, I've supported the renewal of the EXIM Bank because I know what it means to Arkansas manufacturers. I don't feel that, I'm not sure I would go as far as saying that needs to be extended to Cuba. I think most importantly, let's give our businesses the opportunity to negotiate non-cash transactions.
Governor, if a judge doesn't order the state to continue funding Planned Parenthood at some point today, what will the state do in response? I believe the stay expired at midnight.
You're saying if the judge continues the...
If the judge doesn't take any action today to continue to stay the defunding of Planned Parenthood, will the state go ahead and defund Planned Parenthood?
Well, first of all, we're going to follow the order of the court. And right now, the courts have granted a temporary restraining order and saying that Planned Parenthood needs to continue to be an authorized Medicaid provider. If the court lifts that stay, then my directive and the directive of DHS will be enforced, which is that Planned Parenthood will not be qualified as a Medicaid provider.
I do believe it is expired at this point, the stay.
I don't, it continues until the court makes an additional ruling. If it expires, and I expect the court to make an additional ruling so that it's not just left in abeyance. I would expect a ruling prior to the expiration of the TRO.
When Baker issued her ruling a couple weeks ago, you had noted that she was an appointee of President Obama. I guess, do you think her move 2 weeks ago was political, and are you kind of questioning her motivation for this?
No, I certainly would not make that claim. It is traditional in news stories that the media identifies a judge as a Bush appointee, a Reagan appointee, or a Obama appointee. So I thought it was fair commentary for me to make that observation as well.
I guess just kind of clarify on the question from Rhoda. If the order is supposed to expire, I think, 4:55 today. At the end of the day, it passes, and she has not extended that order or issued an injunction. Do you plan on moving forward with terminating the contract?
Yes, that is the directive, and if there's not a stay in place, then the state's directive of decertifying Planned Parenthood goes back into force.
Can that happen immediately, or does that have to be 30 days again?
Might have to bring some real lawyers into the discussion on that, but my understanding would be that we are stayed from enforcing the decertification of Planned Parenthood. If the TRO is not in place, then the decertification is effective again. And there's not really any action that has to be taken. It is just reinstated.
At the legislature, JPR committee, they're doing reviews of contracts with DHS ongoing. There was a request made to subpoena an official from federal HHS to appear before the legislature. I wondered if you've been in any discussions with CMS about getting that to happen, and if you could just comment on the sort of ongoing status of the review of those various contracts with DHS.
I have not talked to CMS about that issue. I have talked to some legislators about their review, and I remarked to them that I applaud their diligence in terms of legislative oversight. I reminded them that we're looking at issues that are historical, that happened before I became governor, and that you know, we want them to recognize how hard we're working to put the right processes in place to make sure that the contract challenges, difficulties, and waste is not repeated in the future. That has been my focus, and I think that's important to clarify. And so that's where we are, and I've not talked to CMS about it.
You mentioned in your comments on Cuba that there were talks of people coming to Arkansas to look at what we're doing. Have you set anything up in regard to Cubans coming to Arkansas to see what we're doing here, or?
Well, we extended an invitation. Of course, the invitation that we extend is dependent upon the United States State Department giving them visas to come. And so we expect to explore that as to whether the State Department is going to give Cuban officials flexibility for those kind of travel. Our travel restrictions for U.S. citizens has been loosened. There's still some categories, 12 categories I think it is, and I think simultaneously it is logical that we give greater freedom of travel of Cuban officials coming to the United States. But that is part of the equation, and we need to verify the State Department's willingness. But I certainly expect the Arkansas Farm Bureau to follow up on that invitation and to see if that can become a reality.
Sir, you're obviously in tune with the Obama administration on the matter of Cuba and the trade, or pretty much in tune. Do you have a sense at all through the AEDC or through your own staff or your own contacts that this thing is really gaining momentum with every week, every month? I mean, are you pretty optimistic about the near-term prospect?
Right, and I'm probably a little bit more constrained than many others in the sense that I have not talked about an immediate lifting of every sanction and the full embargo. I've said we need to take it step by step, which is a little bit more cautious than the Obama administration, because I would like to see those two first steps taken: extension of credit, freedom of travel, and then we need to see a response by the Cuban government in terms of lessening their stranglehold on free enterprise and foreign investment. And they have articulated a greater freedom of foreign investment, greater joint venture opportunities, but we need to see this in practice. And so let's take this a step at a time. But I certainly agree that this has momentum. And they ask me questions about whether the president will further use his executive power to lessen the constraints on travel. And my response was that while he may have additional authorities, the next step should come from the Congress of the United States. And so Congress has to sense the changing mood of the American public. I believe they are. And even though we're in a political season, I expect there to be growing momentum and a greater willingness on Congress to readdress this issue. But the next step should be Congress versus further executive orders.
Governor, this week there was a sheriff testifying before a task force saying that he thinks Arkansas needs another prison. Is that something you're willing to look at farther down the road?
I think that is probably a relevant point that he could have made 6 months ago. I don't think it's a relevant point now. First of all, we've already expanded additional prison space to accommodate about 900 additional prisoners in our state prisons. Secondly, we have made adjustments which has lessened the backlog in our county jails. And if you look at the numbers today in our county jails, the backlog is down really to a much more manageable level. I think it was like 2,500, and it was down to about 1,900. We can get you those exact statistics, but I don't think you can make a case for an additional prison today based upon the changes that have been made and the investments that have been made.
Governor, do you know, did any of the businesses that made the trip to Cuba, did any of them sign a contract while we were down there and make a deal?
The only mutual memorandum that was signed was between the World Trade Center and the Cuban Chamber of Commerce. So that memorandum was signed, reflecting a desire for further exchanges. That's the only one that I'm aware of that was signed. There was a discussion about an exchange agreement between the universities in Arkansas and the University of Havana. There was a very substantive discussion on that opportunity at the University of Havana that President Bobbitt participated in, as well as myself.
Are we at the point, sir, where you can, or have you arranged for anyone at AEDC or perhaps help facilitate Farm Bureau or Poultry Federation or your office to maintain or to, if you will, nourish the contacts that you made while you were in Cuba? Is this going to be an ongoing problem? Have you done everything you can do for now?
No, there needs to be some follow-up, and AEDC will accomplish that. The Arkansas Farm Bureau will pursue that as well. The next step would be a formal invitation, as well as making sure that the State Department is supportive of that, and so there should be follow-up. I think it's, we need to stay in touch and to seize the momentum, but at the same time, we're not going to accomplish great things in terms of our agricultural sales without Congress of the United States taking additional steps.
Have you had a chance to look at the Stevens Group Health Care Report, and when are you going to, when will the public be able to see that?
Good question. It's under legislative wraps, and so I have not seen it. I am anxious to see it, but it's my understanding they're trying to really keep it confidential within the legislative branch until it's presented to the legislative task force. There may be an opportunity for me to be briefed on it prior to that, but I have not seen it, and I am anxious to see it.
You mentioned earlier at Pulaski Tech regarding Manufacturing Day and manufacturers in Cuba. Of course, you talked poultry and agriculture down there. I mean, was manufacturing part of the discussion as well? And that's a big sector here in Arkansas as well. I mean, was that part of the discussion?
We had some Arkansas manufacturers with us that were looking at market sales opportunity. There wasn't any discussions about moving a manufacturing facility there and manufacturing in Cuba for any particular market. I do believe those discussions will happen down the road. But for example, Hannah's Candles out of Fayetteville, small business, went on the trip and had the manufacturer here had those discussions about sales opportunities. And so again, I think that is down the road further, but they are positioning themselves for, with the extensions and enlargement of the Panama Canal, with their openness to Caribbean trade and Central America trade. Cuba is very well positioned geographically as well as logistically to handle manufacturing in that country for a larger market. And to me, that's a very big opportunity for U.S. manufacturers, Arkansas manufacturers, to be able to participate more closely in the market in Cuba, but also to look at a broader Central American market from that. But it's premature because there's not sufficient confidence in the freedom that is necessary for our manufacturers to do business there, where they invest capital, and the Cuban government must persuade the private sector that their investment of capital in Cuba is not greater than the ordinary risk. It's not going to be risk of takeover. It's not going to be risk of centralized control. Are they going to require a joint venture of 50-50 or majority control of the Cuban government? Or are they going to allow the private sector to have majority control? These are the huge issues that the Cuban government has not made decisions on, and they've got to show a willingness, as other countries have, to say we want to do business with private sector investments in Cuba. And that's where I'm saying we need to take a couple of steps and let's let Cuba respond and say we understand what's required to do business. One last question? Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that the Republican congressional leadership has the compassion to move forward from a strategic perspective with doing the legislation necessary to do what you were talking about in Cuba, as opposed to the full open platform of the Obama administration?
There's two bills on the plate right now that can be considered in the Congress. Senator Flake's legislation on expanded travel opportunities, and then Senator Bozeman's legislation. Very bipartisan. The key question is whether the Republican leadership will make a decision to allow votes on some of these bills. And we know we're going through some leadership elections, so we'll see where that goes. Thank you all very much for giving this opportunity to re-engage on a couple different topics. Have a great weekend.